come at the present-day lobby as someone who has worked in Washington and has actually seen the lobby firsthand. When I worked on Capitol Hill as a staffer from 1999 to 2004, I was able to see the lobby and its activities, and I was actually very much proud to help the two lobby groups in their endeavors. And fortunately, I worked for two senators who were very pro-Armenian, so that wasn't an issue. But I also was not blind to the lobby's faults in certain respects, so I'll discuss that as the lecture goes on. Because the American Committee for the Independence of Armenia may not be well known to a lot of you, I think the first part of my lecture will actually be to describe the lobby, how it came into being, what was it trying to accomplish, and then explain what its successes and failures were, and then relate those to the present-day lobby. And I think that's the best way to compare and contrast these two different periods and the different lobbies. So let's start with the early period. The American Committee for the Independence of Armenia reflected, in a sense, a great amount of American public sympathy for the Armenians that occurred immediately after World War I, immediately after the genocide. But it also reflected the weakness of the Armenian community at the time. And the reason I say this is that the American Committee for the Independence of Armenia was really an American non-Armenian group, though it was organized by some Armenians behind the scenes. The driving force behind this lobby was an Armenian-American attorney named Vahan Kardashian, who stood out as something quite unusual within the Armenian-American community at the time. Now let's look at the community at that time and to examine its socioeconomic status. As Bob Myrak, who is very well known to many of you, has pointed out in his book, Torn Between Two Lands, the Armenian-American community was largely a working-class community at the time, made up of largely of factory workers, small shopkeepers, farmers, who had one foot in the old country and one foot in the new country. The community was highly political, but its politics were directed towards the old country. The Armenian political party served as a place of gathering news about the old country and also a social venue for the early immigrants. Now the community did have its share of intellectuals, of course, but they were really geared towards old country politics and the political parties of the Armenian dispersion, not the politics of Washington, D.C. and the policy formation of Washington, D.C. And these Armenian intellectuals were mostly associated with the Armenian language newspapers here in Boston, New York, or in California. Now, one of the most interesting books of the period is the one by M. Vartan Malcolm called The Armenians of America, which was published in 1919. The book is rich in detail about the community. He shows how the community's wage earners were at or near the top of other immigrant groups at the time. It's a way of his boasting of how industrious the Armenians were. But what he also reveals in one of the pages of this interesting book is that the number of attorneys, active Armenian attorneys in America at the time, was no more than 10. And not just in the Boston Armenian community, but nationwide. So you can see how much different that is from today. And also the number of college graduates was probably no more than 250, something around there. And this is out of a total Armenian-American community of something like 80,000 to 100,000 people. Now with such small numbers, that may seem kind of shocking today, but that wasn't unusual for working class immigrant communities of that time. But it just shows you how poor the community was at the time. And many of you I'm speaking about basically your parents or grandparents who, of course, came here and were forced to work long, hard hours in factories. So I need not sort of elaborate on this point. It was also, I think, a highly traumatized community. I think much of the attention these days focuses on trauma of genocide survivors. But there was also trauma for the people who were actually in America at the time. Because when you imagine the situation is, this was largely a bachelor community, sort of working in factories. And then when the genocide occurred, they were basically cut off from news about what happened to their loved ones. And of course, there was a great deal of uncertainty and helplessness at the time. One writer in the community actually described the mood of the community as, "The Armenians in the expatriation of those days were lost in deep despair." Excuse me. "One could only see grief and sorrow in their faces, pools of tears in the depths of their eyes, and each Armenian uttered a fiery moan." So that was the mood. Now, some of the community acted in a very strong way as a result of the genocide. When they got news of the genocide, the community formed the Armenian National Union of America in 1917. Its purpose was threefold. First, to send volunteers to fight the Turks, collect funds for the refugees and the rebuilding of a new Armenia, and enlist the support for a pro-Armenia campaign in the United States. Now, out of a really working class community, the community really sort of donated a lot of money to this effort. Something like $930,000 was actually collected in a matter of 2 years, when you consider that's a lot of money for very small wage earners. And it sent 1,000, almost 200 men as gamavors, volunteers, to the Levant to fight the Turks with the assistance of the French and the British. But it failed. It failed in one of the most important challenges facing it. One was to convince the Woodrow Wilson administration to declare war on Turkey in 1917. Because the United States entered the war in 1917, declared war on Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but not against Turkey. And this was largely because the missionary establishment in America felt that it would put an end to their missionary and relief work in the Ottoman Empire. And the missionaries, particularly Cleveland Dodge, who was very close to Woodrow Wilson, convinced him not to do so. So within the community, though the National Union could mobilize the community to do certain things, like collect money, send volunteers, it showed a lack of political clout, despite widespread American public support for the Armenians. So the National Union was therefore no match for the missionary lobby, which, while sympathetic towards Armenians for obvious reasons, had its own agenda. So the National Union failed in this first political endeavor. The National Union also became bogged down in internal Armenian politics. The consensus, the union was formed as a consensus. In fact, various Armenian political parties were formed around the union. But it broke down over the question of how they should view the new Armenian Republic that was born in May of 1918. The Republic, as many of you know, was dominated by the ARF, or the Dashnak Suktun party, and they said that their efforts were a heroic effort in the face of widespread chaos, and they owe their dominant position there to their widespread popular support. The non-ARF elements within the Armenian-American community said the ARF was acting out of political adventurism, and that the new Armenian state should not be in the Caucasus where it was first formed, but in Western Armenia, or Turkish Armenia, where the refugees from the genocide had come from. So the National Union, as a sort of a catalyst to move the Armenian community forward, failed on the sort of national political scene in Washington, and also it succumbed to internal Armenian politics. But before its complete demise, the National Union formed the Armenian Press Bureau in New York and asked Vahan Kardashian to head it. Kardashian, I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about him. He was born in what we call Gesaria, and he attended American missionary and French Jesuit schools, came to the United States, actually married a wealthy American socialite, and through her connections he actually got into Yale University. He became an outstanding student, and he became a lawyer, opened a law practice in New York City, and started making a lot of money. He also made a lot of political connections at this time. Interestingly enough, from 1911 to 1915, Kardashian was also the attorney for the Turkish consulate in New York and the Turkish embassy in Washington, D.C. This wasn't so unusual because at the time, many Armenians, of course, worked in the service of the Ottoman Empire. But in this capacity, he met a lot of American politicians, religious figures, prominent individuals, and he was the High Commissioner for the Turkish exhibit at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, where he met numerous American political figures like William Jennings Bryan and others. Now, the genocide in 1915 led Kardashian to completely sever all of his ties with the Turks, and he became an avowed Turkophobe and then a ceaseless supporter of the Armenian cause. I believe I can't prove it, but I think his passion, his vehemence, were the result of, I think, a kind of a deep guilt feeling that he had when the genocide occurred, because here he was, in Washington, in this official capacity as attorney for the Turkish embassy, but his own mother and sister actually perished in the genocide, and I think he never probably got over that fact. And so there was this, there's a real passion and vitriolic sort of sentiment that you can see in Kardashian's writings. Anyway, Kardashian, as head of the Armenian Press Bureau, then came to realize that the National Union was incapable of doing the necessary political work to achieve and sustain Armenian independence. He also had personality clashes with the head of the Armenian National Union, whose name was Miran Sevasli. And he said to other people that he felt Sevasli was an ineffective leader. So Kardashian and his associates with the Armenian Press Bureau, which was actually based in New York at the time, began to think about creating a new organization. And I think the reasons for this new organization were threefold. One was the Allies, including the United States, despite all of its comments about creating or helping the Armenians after the terrible massacres that took place in 1915, were actually vague about what would be the actual post-war settlement for Armenia. And even President Wilson's 14 points only mentions non-Turks should have, quote, an unmolested opportunity for autonomous development. But that's a lot of words, and what does that actually mean? That was a big question mark. And Henry White of the US Peace Mission, that's the group that went with Wilson to the Versailles Peace Conference, responded in a letter to Kardashian that, quote, it is impossible for me to say whether Armenian independence will be attained or not at the approaching conference. And then two, the Allies had secretly actually divided up the Ottoman Empire among themselves in secret treaties. There was a London Agreement of 1915 and the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which actually divided the Arab lands between the British and the French, but divided the Armenian territories and the Armenian plateau between the Russians and the French. And Kardashian was very strongly anti-imperialistic, so he was very concerned about that the Allies were actually going to partake in the spoils and not deliver Armenian independence or sustain Armenian independence. And three, many of the American missionaries supported an American mandate, a trusteeship for the whole of Anatolia. That's because their missions were spread throughout, not just for Armenia alone. And for Kardashian, this in his mind, would put the Armenian population at risk, because eventually it would build up the Turkish nation, and then in his mind, they would then embark on another genocidal campaign. Now, there were a number of sympathetic American politicians during this period, particularly Henry Cabot Lodge, who was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Lodge actually sponsored a Senate resolution early December 1918 calling for the independence of all of Armenia, all of Armenian historical lands. And this actually passed the Senate. And Lodge became an executive member of the American Committee for the Independence of Armenia. Kardashian and his associates then began to organize the ACIA, as I'll call it now. They held a large banquet in New York City in February 1919. Many prominent American officials attended. The keynote speaker was the former Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes. Members of the Wilson administration were at this banquet. And Charles Evans Hughes had this quote at this banquet. He said, "There is no doubt about the capacity of the Armenians for freedom. They are capable as any people. They have a racial solidarity and a capacity to survive incredible misfortune. They have rare intelligence, and no people prize more highly the advantages of education. We propose tonight to throw such influence as we have into the scale for Armenian independence. So that was the sentiment of the time and of these prominent American officials. Now the ACIA favored either a mandate for Armenia alone or direct US aid to Armenia without a mandate. This would be military aid, munitions, supplies, economic aid, and perhaps American soldiers. And up through the summer of 1919, it appeared that there was strong American public support for a mandate for Armenia. In fact, the editorials of the New York Times supported this concept, as did other American newspapers. However, the idea of assistance to Armenia got bogged down and ultimately became a victim of American politics. Wilson's top priority was the League of Nations. Wilson believed that the question of a mandate should be deferred until the Senate approved the Versailles Treaty with the League of Nations covenant. And Wilson also believed he could not unilaterally send US troops to Armenia without congressional authorization. Now here we have this kind of American political dance in the American political system, where Henry Cabot Lodge tells Kardashian and Girard that only the president has the authority to send troops to Armenia. On August 8th, Henry Cabot Lodge wrote to James Girard, who was the executive of this ACIA and a former US ambassador to Germany, that in response to the massacres of the Armenians, quote, "I feel as you do about the necessity of aid to Armenia. It is a frightful thing, it is a frightful tragedy what is going on there. But there is nothing on earth Congress can do. It is an executive matter. We cannot order troops. We are not in control of the peace conference." But Woodrow Wilson believed only Congress had the authority to authorize troops. So they were playing a kind of a political game with each other on who would actually send troops to Armenia, or if they could. Finally, a month later, in September of 1919, Woodrow Wilson's friend, John Sharp Williams, a Democratic senator from Mississippi, and was also an executive member of the lobby group, the ACIA, introduced a resolution subsequently called the Williams Resolution that would allow the president to send troops to Armenia and to suspend the Foreign Enlistment Act to allow Armenian-Americans to join the Armenian army. However, Henry Cabot Lodge sent the resolution to a subcommittee chaired by Warren Harding, who was a Republican senator from Ohio at the time, and also Harry New, a Republican senator from Indiana. And when they sent it to the subcommittee, it sat there for months. And Lodge confided in his friend Elihu Root, a former senator from New York, but who was also an executive member of the ACIA, that, quote, "Wilson is, quote, an utterly treacherous and sinister figure. Armenia is a tragedy, but I do not believe you could get the American Congress to send troops there." So what you have by the fall of 1919 was a situation where there was actually growing isolationist sentiment in America, which the American people started losing support for international obligations overseas. And then you had the Armenian question being bogged down within internal American party politics. And all of this was dooming aid to Armenia. And let's just fast forward a little bit to April of 1920. At that particular point, the Allies who were meeting in San Remo in Italy formally asked Woodrow Wilson to accept a mandate for Armenia and to delineate the border between Armenia and Turkey to include the 4 Turkish Armenian provinces. Now Wilson accepted this invitation in May, but of course it required Senate approval. Meanwhile, Harding substituted his own resolution for the Williams Resolution. And this resolution by Harding only congratulated the Armenian Republic on its independence, and it expressed hope that it would realize its national aspirations, but it said nothing about US troops or assistance to Armenia. It only authorized a US ship to evacuate American relief workers from the port of Batum in Georgia. Now the Harding resolution passed the Senate, unanimously that same month, but it really amounted to nothing. And James Gerard, the executive director of the ACIA, who was very close to Vahan Kardashian, expressed his deep disappointment to Lodge, who replied, quote, "It was only with some difficulty that we got as much as we did." Wilson then sent the mandate up to the Senate, and Gerard and Kardashian believed actually this was very foolhardy at the time, because the last thing they wanted was a negative vote. They realized that the Kemalist Turks, who were consolidating power in Anatolia, would see a negative vote against the US mandate as something that would encourage them to actually attack Armenia. And so then Gerard and Wilson prevailed on the Wilson administration not to do it, but the Wilson administration went ahead and did it. Now, why Woodrow Wilson went ahead with this, one never knows, because the political tea leaves, as they say in Washington, were such that it was going to go down to defeat. But I think, maybe Wilson felt he had an obligation both to the European allies that he would do it, but also I think he felt it would maybe cleanse him of his own sort of guilt by not moving on the Armenian issue sooner. So he felt he had to go through with the process of sending a mandate up to the Senate. He may have also banked on the fact that there was a lot of pro-Armenian sentiment still in the United States, despite growing isolationism, and he felt maybe, who knows, but maybe that the senators would have a different view. But Henry Cabot Lodge, I think, who comes across as a very cynical figure in all of this process, actually did not take part in the debate on the mandate, but was the floor manager. Floor manager in the Senate means somebody who actually directs other members to participate in debate. And he definitely wanted to kill the mandate idea. And when the vote was taken, there were actually two votes. There was a negative vote that he proposed Lodge, and then there was a positive vote. And the positive vote for a mandate, only 12 senators voted in favor of it. And some members of the Senate actually cited the large financial costs. They mistakenly used actually the numbers for a mandate for the whole of Anatolia, not just for Armenia. But the Chicago Tribune in April of that year said, quote, "It is Armenia's crowning misfortune, with a mandate going begging, that it has no oil wells. What a difference oil makes in the white man's burden." And the comment here is that the British and the French were seeking to carve up the Middle East for their own economic interests. But nobody wanted Armenia because it didn't have oil, didn't have rich natural resources. So the Europeans were trying to lob off their Armenian mandate to the United States and found a receptive audience in Wilson. But by the time all of this took place, it was much too late. Now, in the fall of 1920, the Kemalist Turks attacked the Armenian Republic while the Bolsheviks were occupying the Caucasus. And then on December 2nd, the Armenian Republic opted for Sovietization to save the rest of the Republic from falling to the Turks. So the whole enterprise then, you could say, lasted about a year and a half or to almost 2 years, the ACIA, but then with the fall of the Armenian Republic, things seemed to have come to an end. But Vahan Kardashian was a very committed figure, and he refused to give up the fight. In his philosophy, he believed that one day both the Kemalist Turkish regime and the Bolshevik regime would fall. So it would be very important to preserve Armenia's rights, at least on a diplomatic front, at least on paper. So to his credit, he never gave up. Now, the lobby got sort of a jolt of inspiration during the whole debate of the so-called Lausanne Treaty. And let me explain this a little bit. As some of you know, the Sèvres Treaty was the one that actually gave a paper award to Armenia, but that was with the Ottoman government. And then, of course, Kemalist Turkey was on the rise and basically wanted a new treaty with the Allies. So the Allies negotiated a Treaty of Lausanne, which was finally came to be in 1923. Now, the Americans were not at war with Turkey, so they only had observers at Lausanne. but the Turks had an inclination that they said they wanted then to negotiate a separate treaty between the United States and Turkey. Now this treaty was called officially the Treaty of Amity and Commerce between the United States and Turkey. It was negotiated shortly after the official Lausanne Treaty. But in the American political context, it was all sort of lumped together, and within the American political context, that particular treaty with the U.S. was simply called the Lausanne Treaty. But here, I think Kardashian learned the game of hardball politics from his earlier years with the lobby. For the United States to actually approve a treaty by the Constitution, you need 2/3 majority in the Senate. So therefore, if there were something like 48 states of the Union at the time, you needed something in order of 65 or so, or 64, some mathematician can do the math here, to actually approve the treaty. So you could actually defeat the treaty by not having the Senate get that many votes. So Kardashian then put all of the resources of the lobby group into defeating this particular treaty. There was also a charge that the United States negotiators at Lausanne actually bartered away Armenia's rights for an oil concession. And this gets a little complicated, but let me sort of lay this out to you. The actual treaty, the American Treaty of Lausanne, was signed on August 6, 1923. 4 days later, the Turkish government, the Turkish parliament, approved what's called the Chester Concession. And this was a huge venture by an American company led by a former Navy admiral, Chester, to actually build a railroad line through what is now considered historic Armenia. And within that concession, that company would then have exclusive rights to mineral deposits on 25 kilometers of each side of that proposed railroad. In fact, Turkish historians, not just Armenian historians, have actually said that Turkey approved this oil concession, or this concession, a railroad/oil concession, because they wanted a more pliant United States negotiating team. So obviously there was some sort of bargaining behind the scenes, considering the fact that this vote on the concession was shortly after the American Treaty was concluded. Now Kardashian cleverly used this for partisan political purposes. In fact, at the Democratic National Convention in 1924, he actually worked with some leading Democrats to get a plank approved in the committee platform. Here, let me just sort of read you that. It says, we condemn the Lausanne Treaty. It barters legitimate American rights and betrays Armenia for the Chester oil concession. We favor the protection of American rights in Turkey and the fulfillment of President Wilson's arbitral award respecting Armenia. And that was in the Democratic Party platform of 1924. And during the party convention of 1924, Senator Pat Harrison of Missouri stated in a speech, "When the Christian women and children of Armenia were being wantonly given to the Turkish sword, when thousands of these Armenian followers of Christ, driven like cattle into exile, were dying of starvation and exposure in the highways, when Christian churches and Christian homes were being given to the flames, and ministers of the gospel importuned the administration for a note of protest, it was refused. But the moment the oil magnates of the land saw the concession in the oil fields of Mosul, the administration that refused to intervene to save Christian lives, Christian churches, and even Christian homes went to the front with vigor and decision." Then he ends his speech, "Show this administration oil well, and it will show you a foreign policy." That was in 1924. So there were basically two groups lined up against each other on this treaty fight. Kardashian gathered together, of course, Democratic partisans, as I read just now, disillusioned relief workers, and many American relief workers were very upset that nothing was done for Armenia politically in the aftermath of the whole League of Nations debacle. And he also included even xenophobes, people did not wanting to deal with foreigners. I mean, it was a sort of an odd mix, but he cleverly sort of put a coalition together. Then on the other side of the debate was people who were pro-treaty. This included, of course, the new Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, the person who actually gave the keynote address at the beginning of the formation of the ACIA. He argued that American commercial interests and missionary interests would be secured by approving this new treaty. Now, just as a little aside, Kardashian had a very short temper, and at one point he was so incensed that Charles Evans Hughes turned his back on Armenia that he even told his friends he was going to go down to Washington, D.C. to shoot Hughes. And his friends really had to restrain him and keep him under kind of house arrest to basically to calm him down. But as we'll discuss in the portion of the talk of similarities and differences, it's not unusual for politicians outside of office to say one thing, and then of course once in office to say something else. Now, the Coolidge Administration, well, first of all, let me just talk about the oil scandal. There certainly was something to it, though, of course, the whole oil scandal may have been exaggerated. In fact, the Chester oil concession actually fell apart several months later. The American group couldn't get their finances in order, and then the Turkish National Assembly had a change of heart. But nonetheless, the 1920s were famous for oil scandals. I mean, that was the administration of Calvin, first was Warren G. Harding, and then Calvin Coolidge. There was a lot of scandals in both those administrations, particularly the Teapot Dome scandal. Obviously it was used for political purposes, but nonetheless, the fact that you had leading politicians mentioning that you're bartering away Armenian rights for oil had a certain resonance within the American public at the time because of all the other oil scandals that were going around at the time. Now, the forces that were supporting the treaty were the missionary establishment, American industrialists who wanted to do business in Turkey, and also sort of just in terms of the State Department wanting to have a new relationship with the new Kemalist Turkey, because they felt that other Europeans were having relations and they would fall behind. Now, the Coolidge administration saw the political tea leaves and figured out that they shouldn't send the treaty to the United States Senate right away because it would be immediately defeated. So what their strategy was that to delay the process. And they delayed the process hoping to build up more pro-treaty sentiment. But Kardashian sort of met them at every turn. And he would write memos and go on speaking tours and write to members of Congress, so to drum up publicity against the treaty. So the treaty was actually finally sent to the Senate in January of 1927, and it was actually defeated by 50 votes for and 34 against, not enough for the necessary 2/3 majority. And Senator King of Utah summed up the reason for the defeat. And let me just read you his passage. Excuse me. Obviously, it would be unfair and unreasonable for the United States to recognize and respect the claim and profession of Mustafa Kemal Pasha so long as he persists in holding control and sovereignty over Wilson, Armenia, now a no man's land, while nearly 1 million Armenian refugees and exiles are people without a country. So certainly Kardashian tried to keep the Armenian question alive through his opposition to this Lausanne Treaty. And in that he was successful. But going back to the US Constitution, a president has sole authority to recognize another government. So what happened was that the Coolidge administration, even though they were defeated in this treaty, were then able to recognize, this was kind of plan B, recognize the Kemalist Turkish regime through the use of executive powers. Kardashian was incensed by this and threatened a lawsuit against President Calvin Coolidge, but he was not successful. And in fact, that was kind of the death knell of the Armenian lobby at that time. Kardashian, just as a footnote, actually continued to fight on until his death in 1933. And he was actually alone at this period because he sort of lacked our Armenian community support at this time. And the community, was such that, with all the defeat of the mandate, the defeat of U.S. aid, the fact that the United States now recognized the new Kemalist regime in Turkey, all of that made a lot of the Armenian-American community sort of turn away from sort of American politics and concentrate on sort of building new lives in America, as genocide survivors and their offspring. So this was kind of a sad ending to, I think, a heroic but a futile attempt on behalf of this lobby. So I wanted to spend some time sort of talking about this lobby just to give you some indication of what it was all about before we sort of talk about the differences between that lobby and the current lobby, because we can draw some interesting conclusions and learn some lessons here. The first difference is the socioeconomic conditions, which was pretty obvious between the Armenian-American community then and the Armenian-American community today. In fact, one of the reasons why we can see that it was actually a non-Armenian-American lobby in favor of Armenia was because the Armenian-American community was so weak and really politically unsophisticated in terms of American politics. So there was a huge difference now, and of course in socioeconomic status, whereas a community before was largely of factory laborers, farmers, small shopkeepers. Now, of course, we have professionals, entrepreneurs, industrialists, academics. Most young people in America today are college educated. And of course, the monetary issue. There's a lot more, of course, money in the community today. And I'm not an expert on sort of campaign finance in 1918, but in terms of how Congress is run today, of course, congressmen need a lot of money to win office. That's just the basic fact of life these days. And of course, the community has been able to get some influence by having fundraisers for various members of Congress. So that's sort of one big difference. The other big difference is organization. The two lobby groups today, of course, the Armenian Assembly of America and the Armenian National Committee of America, they both are organizing, they both have offices in Washington, but also are organizing branches around the country. And having worked in Washington, this is sort of a fact that may not be very well known, but sometimes all you need is really a group of like 20 or 30 committed individuals to get the ear of a congressman. And if there's no countervailing pressure, that congressman will vote for you. One of the interesting things is, say, Senator George Allen today, who has expressed some interest, I think, in running for president, even though he's in a tough re-election bid for Senate. But a group of Richmond Armenians sort of got to him early in his political career, and the Richmond Armenian community is not very big, but they were able to educate him about the Armenian issues. And so today on Capitol Hill, he's considered one of the friends of the Armenian community. So as long as you have sort of a certain organization, you can do a lot. And of course, you can't underestimate the personal contacts. You sort of throw yourself back in time and you say to yourself, well, can you imagine sort of a factory worker, an Armenian factory worker, say in Lawrence or Lowell, rubbing elbows with a leading American politician in 1918? It's really not conceivable. But today, it's very conceivable that the sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters of that factory worker would very easily rub elbows with these leading American politicians. So that's why I think the socioeconomic conditions is one of the big differences that we see today. Now, another difference is the pro-Armenian sentiment. It was actually much higher in the earlier period than it is today. In fact, Herbert Hoover, of course, who was president in the late 20s and 30s, but before then was head of a lot of relief work, he actually made a statement in one of his books where he said, quote, Probably Armenia was known to the American school child in 1919 only a little less than England. The association of Mount Ararat and Noah, the staunch Christians who were massacred periodically by the Mohammedan Turks, and the Sunday school collections over 50 years for alleviating their miseries, all accumulate to impress the name Armenia on the front of the American mind.